It was a crisp autumn afternoon when Michael Jordan spotted her. His former teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Davis, huddled on a cold bench, her once vibrant white coat now faded and torn, a cardboard sign in her lap. "Anything helps," it read, but the words felt like a cruel irony. Michael's heart skipped a beat. This was a woman who had once stood in front of him, full of passion, guiding him through life's toughest lessons. The woman who had encouraged his every dream, even when he didn't believe in himself. But now she looked nothing like the teacher he had admired, nothing like the sharp, vibrant figure who had inspired him to pursue his own greatness. Michael stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He thought he had seen everything in his life, the glitz, the glamour, the endless adoration. But nothing could prepare him for this moment. He hesitated for only a split second, but it was long enough for Mrs. Davis to look up at him with hollow eyes. The recognition was immediate. Her face froze, and then, just as quickly, it hardened into a mask of defiance, but not in the way Michael remembered. "Please, don't," she whispered, her voice trembling with a vulnerability Michael had never heard from her. "I don't need your pity." But Michael couldn't look away. His heart pounded in his chest. How had this happened? How had the woman who once believed in him fallen so far? As Michael stood there, frozen, the wind cutting through the narrow alley, a single question lingered in the air. What had led Mrs. Davis to this life? The answers would haunt him forever. As Michael stood frozen on the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on the woman sitting hunched over on the bench, a sudden chill crawled up his spine. The more he stared, the more unmistakable the familiarity became. He had always been a man of action, someone who controlled every aspect of his life. But right now, his world felt like it was slipping through his fingers. It was her, Mrs. Eleanor Davis. His former teacher, the one who had once encouraged him when no one else did. She had seen something in him, believed in him when he could barely believe in himself. But now, she was here, sitting in the grime of the city, a life of dignity and pride reduced to nothing more than an empty sign and a worn coat. The sight was almost impossible to digest. Mrs. Davis had once been a beacon of strength, standing tall in front of a classroom full of students, her eyes sharp with purpose and wisdom. But now, she looked small and fragile, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world had collapsed onto them. Michael took a step forward, his feet heavy, unsure whether he should approach. His heart raced as he debated within himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. The world had given him everything. Yet here she was, the woman who had shaped his childhood, left in the streets with nothing. He hadn't asked for this moment, but here it was, thrust upon him. His privilege felt like a weight he couldn't bear. What was he supposed to do? The first wave of emotion was shock, a cold, heart-stopping disbelief that gripped him tightly. The woman who had once shaped his destiny with her lessons, her patience, her belief in him, was now a shadow of her former self. Michael wanted to turn away, to leave the street and forget what he had seen. But he couldn't. His stomach churned with guilt. He had never imagined this, never thought of how someone like Mrs. Davis might have ended up this way. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had left her behind. He hadn't meant to. He hadn't even realized it had happened. Life had simply moved on, and he had gone with it, leaving behind the people who had mattered most to him. All those years, all those lessons, had they meant nothing? He could feel his pulse in his temples as the weight of the moment bore down on him. He was a success. He had everything anyone could want. And yet, in this moment, none of it felt meaningful. But the strangest part was that it wasn't just guilt that surged through him. It was a deep sense of responsibility, a nagging feeling that he couldn't ignore. Was he really going to walk away? Michael stood there, his mind a battlefield of emotions. Should he approach her? Should he do something? But what could he do? What would she even want from him? It had been so many years since they had last spoken. What if she didn't want his help? The questions twisted in his mind, each one making it harder to take a step forward. He felt torn between his instinct to help and his fear of doing the wrong thing. He wasn't sure what he was afraid of. Was it the embarrassment of offering charity? The fear of being judged by others? Or was it something deeper, a fear of confronting the person he had once been and the person he was now? He wanted to be the man who stepped in, who made things right, but there was a voice in his head telling him to stay away, to let her be. It wasn't his problem. She had her own life, her own choices. But deep down, Michael knew that wasn't true. This wasn't just about a homeless woman. It was about confronting his own guilt, his own sense of privilege. The more he stood there, the more he felt the weight of the moment pushing him toward her. As the wind whipped around him, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Every step forward felt like a leap into the unknown, every thought spinning faster. Was he helping because it was the right thing to do? Or was it just because he couldn't bear the thought of doing nothing? Finally, with his heart pounding in his chest, Michael took a step closer, his feet moving before his mind could catch up. This was his chance. He couldn't walk away now. He owed her more than that. Michael stood before Mrs. Davis, his breath shallow, his chest tight with indecision. The question still echoed in his mind. Should he offer help? He had never been the type to shy away from taking action, but this moment was different. This wasn't a charity case or a business deal. This was someone who had been there for him when he had nothing but dreams, someone who had seen potential in him when he couldn't see it in himself. Yet here she was, her once pristine coat frayed and dirt-streaked, sitting in the dirt and looking up at him with eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of pain. The distance between who she had been and who she was now felt insurmountable. And as Michael stood frozen, he realized how much he had taken for granted in his life. The luxury, the ease, the opportunities. He couldn't walk away from this. Not when it was her. He took a breath, steeling himself for what he knew he had to do. He approached her slowly, as if unsure of what would come next. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was no turning back now. "Mrs. Davis?" he said softly, his voice betraying his nerves. Her eyes flickered up, surprised, before narrowing slightly. Recognition washed over her face, but it was quickly replaced by a guarded expression, one Michael didn't expect. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to pause, the sounds of the city muffled by the weight of the encounter. It was as if everything was leading up to this one moment, and Michael had no idea how it would unfold. He cleared his throat, his words faltering for a second. "I didn't expect to find you here. I want to help." She looked away, her eyes flicking to the ground, as if the very idea of help was something foreign, something that felt like an insult to her pride. "I don't need your charity," she said quietly, her voice rough from the cold. Michael's chest tightened. She was rejecting him, and he couldn't understand why. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with her pushing him away, her walls high and impenetrable. But he couldn't let her slip away again. Not like this. "I'm not offering charity," he said, the words more forceful than he intended. "I'm offering help. You've always been there for me. Please, let me return the favor." Mrs. Davis shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasping the cardboard sign in her lap as though it were a lifeline. "I don't want your pity. You've made it. You have everything now. And I'm not the person I used to be." Her voice cracked, and Michael's heart clenched. The words stung, but he knew they were coming from a place of pride, not anger. She wasn't ashamed of being on the streets. She was ashamed of needing help. She wasn't broken. She was just trying to survive in a world that had left her behind. Michael knelt down in front of her, his eyes meeting hers. "You're not alone," he said softly. "I won't pretend I understand what you've been through, but I do understand what you did for me, and I'm not walking away." For the first time, Mrs. Davis looked up at him fully, her eyes searching his face, as if she were trying to figure out whether he meant it, whether he really saw her. The tension in the air was thick, but in that moment, something shifted. Mrs. Davis's defenses began to crumble, just slightly, but enough for Michael to see the rawness beneath. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "You don't know what it's like, Michael," she whispered. "You don't know what it's like to wake up every day, knowing that your life is over, that the dreams you had are just dust. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't known. How could he have? He had always been running forward, climbing higher, never once looking back at the people who had helped him get there. Never once stopping to ask if they were okay. "I can't pretend to know what you've been through," he said, his voice low. "But I can listen. I can help you find a way out. You taught me that people don't get where they are alone. We all need someone." For a long moment, they simply sat there in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Mrs. Davis wiped at her eyes, her hand trembling slightly. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over the screen as he looked at her. "You don't have to do this alone anymore. Let me help." She looked at him, then down at her hands, struggling with her pride. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that had been buried deep inside her for too long. A sense of trust, maybe, or just the quietest glimmer of hope. And in that moment Michael knew this was only the beginning. Michael's heart raced as he helped Mrs. Davis to her feet, his arm gently supporting her frail body. She was still hesitant, unsure of the sincerity of his offer, but he was determined. This was his moment to make things right. The weight of her life, of all the missed opportunities, was on his shoulders now. There was no backing down. "I'm not letting you stay here," Michael said, his voice firm but gentle, as if convincing himself as much as her. "Come with me. I'll get you a room for the night, and we'll figure this out." Mrs. Davis stiffened, her eyes narrowing, the familiar pride still clinging to her like an old friend. "I told you," she muttered. "I don't need your charity." But Michael could see the weariness in her eyes, the exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. A deep, soul-crushing fatigue that only someone who had lost everything could understand. "I'm not offering charity," Michael insisted. "I'm offering you a chance to rest, a chance to feel like a person again, just for one night." His voice softened as he spoke, and after a long silence, she relented. Michael helped her into the car, and they drove in tense quiet, heading toward a small but comfortable hotel Michael often stayed at. The city lights cast a golden glow through the windows, but the silence between them was heavy, filled with 1,000 unspoken words. Once they reached the hotel, Michael arranged for a room. He ensured she had food, warm clothes, and the space she needed to recover from the day's hardships. But that wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. He needed to do more. Much more. As Michael sat next to Mrs. Davis in the room, watching her eat the meal he had arranged, something inside him shifted. She didn't look at him with distrust anymore. There was a quiet acceptance in her eyes now, a softening of the defiance she had shown when they first met. Her hands trembled slightly as she put the spoon down, and her gaze met his. "Thank you," she whispered, the words a rare and fragile offering. Michael felt a lump form in his throat. This woman, who had once believed in him when no one else did, was now thanking him for simply offering a night of safety and warmth. She had endured so much alone, and all he had done was offer her something that, to him, seemed so small: a bed, food, a moment of peace. As he watched her, he began to understand something that had eluded him for years. The wealth, the success, the fame, none of it meant anything if it wasn't used to help others. He had spent so much of his life consumed by ambition, always chasing the next deal, the next triumph, without ever stopping to think about what mattered most. Mrs. Davis had given him something more valuable than any accolade ever could. She had taught him to see beyond the surface, to understand the struggles of others, to appreciate the value of human connection. And now, as he looked at her, he realized that he had to do more. He couldn't just give her a night of comfort and walk away. She needed more than that. They both did. Michael leaned forward, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I know this doesn't fix everything, but I can help you rebuild, if you're willing to let me. I have a place at my company for you, a chance to start fresh. You don't have to live like this anymore." Mrs. Davis looked at him, her eyes wide, a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "You're serious?" Michael nodded. "I'm serious. I'll make sure you have the resources you need." You've spent so much time helping others. It's your turn to have someone help you. No more struggle. No more loneliness." She didn't respond immediately, but the tension in her face softened, the tightness in her jaw slowly releasing. For the first time in what felt like forever, Michael saw a glimpse of the woman she had once been: proud, strong, capable. I never thought I'd hear those words again," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." It was a simple act of kindness, offering her a job, a place in his world again, but it was more than just an offer of work. It was a lifeline. It was the restoration of dignity. It was a chance for Mrs. Davis to rebuild not just her life, but her sense of self-worth. As Michael watched her, a wave of gratitude washed over him, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. In helping her, he had found a part of himself he had forgotten. He had found purpose, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The night was far from over, but the path forward had already begun to take shape, for both of them. In the weeks that followed, Michael didn't just offer Mrs. Davis a temporary solution. He worked tirelessly to help her rebuild. He knew that one night of comfort, no matter how kind, wouldn't be enough. She needed a fresh start, a real chance to reclaim her dignity, to stand on her own 2 feet once again. Michael used his connections to secure stable housing for her, finding a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood where she could start over without the constant fear of the streets. He also arranged for job training, enrolling her in a program that could offer her skills that would open doors. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but Michael was determined. He made sure she had everything she needed, from groceries to medical care. But perhaps most importantly, he was there for her every step of the way. He checked in regularly, offering encouragement and making sure she didn't feel isolated. He knew that the emotional support, the connection, was just as vital as anything else. Mrs. Davis, once so reluctant to accept help, had begun to embrace this new chapter. She had her own apartment now, a job training program that was helping her regain her confidence, and the warmth of knowing that someone truly cared. Michael's efforts were no longer just about alleviating her immediate suffering. They were about creating a future where she could thrive again. As Michael continued to help Mrs. Davis, something profound began to shift within him. What started as an attempt to right the wrongs of the past had evolved into a deeper, more personal journey. The satisfaction he had felt from his wealth and success seemed distant now. It wasn't the financial victories or public recognition that fulfilled him anymore. It was seeing Mrs. Davis regain a sense of herself, witnessing the quiet but powerful transformation in her. In watching her grow stronger, Michael confronted his own growth. The realization that helping others, offering true support, was more rewarding than all the accolades or power he had accumulated. His initial motivation had been rooted in guilt, in the need to make up for his previous neglect of those who had mattered in his life. But what he discovered was far more than that. It was a profound sense of fulfillment that came from contributing to another person's healing. For the first time, Michael understood what real wealth meant. It wasn't just the numbers on his bank account or the prestige attached to his name. It was the ability to give back, to change lives, to offer people a second chance when the world had given up on them. Mrs. Davis had given him that lesson, in ways he never could have imagined. As the months passed, Michael and Mrs. Davis formed a bond that transcended mere charity. They became partners in an unexpected, yet deeply meaningful way. Mrs. Davis had found her footing again, not just in a job or a home, but in her sense of self-worth. And Michael had found something he never knew he was missing: a deeper, more authentic connection with another human being. They stayed in touch, of course. Mrs. Davis visited him occasionally, updating him on her progress and sharing her newfound confidence. And Michael made sure to check in, not as someone offering help, but as a friend, a true ally. They had become each other's support system, and Michael couldn't have been more grateful for the relationship they had built. Eventually, Michael even invited her to speak at one of his charity events, where she shared her story with others. It wasn't just a moment of triumph for her. It was a moment of triumph for both of them, a symbol of what could be achieved through kindness, perseverance, and human connection. Mrs. Davis found herself surrounded by people who admired her strength, and Michael learned to be vulnerable with the world. They had both grown in ways they hadn't expected, and the future felt open to them. Full of potential, full of meaning. Their relationship wasn't just about giving or receiving. It was about shared humanity, about standing side by side and lifting each other up. And so, as Michael walked away from each encounter with Mrs. Davis, he carried with him something far more valuable than any business deal or financial success. A deeper understanding of the world and the people in it. And for the first time in a long while, he felt whole. Michael had once thought that success was measured in numbers, the weight of his bank account, the size of his empire. But now, he understood that true wealth was far more elusive. It was in the way he could change someone's life with a single gesture, how compassion could heal wounds that money could never touch. He had started out wanting to make things right for Mrs. Davis, but in doing so, he had found a piece of himself that he hadn't known was missing. His life had shifted, transformed not by his achievements, but by his ability to truly see and care for another person. His journey wasn't just about lifting someone else. It was about lifting himself, finding purpose in the connection that was always there, waiting to be discovered. Sometimes the smallest gesture can change everything. One act of kindness, no matter how insignificant it may seem, can spark a ripple effect that transforms lives. In helping another, we might discover our own redemption, a chance to heal, to grow, and to make the world a little brighter. Change begins with us, in every moment, in every choice. We all have the power to offer compassion and to create a future filled with hope.